a federal appeals court just delivered a devastating blow to Donald Trump's trade empire, ruling that most of his sweeping global tariffs are completely illegal. But Trump isn't backing down. In fact, he's doubling down with a Supreme Court appeal that could reshape presidential power forever. This isn't just about trade policy. This is about whether a president can bypass Congress and impose what amounts to a massive tax on American consumers. And the stakes couldn't be higher. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit delivered its verdict Friday in a crushing 7-4 decision. The court found that Trump had no legal authority to impose his sweeping tariffs under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. These aren't minor trade adjustments we're talking about. Trump's tariff regime covers nearly every U.S. trading partner and has generated a staggering $142 billion in revenue by July alone, more than double what was collected at the same point last year. The court's reasoning was straightforward but damning. As the majority ruling stated, tariffs are fundamentally a congressional power under the Constitution. The IEPA may give presidents emergency powers, but nowhere in that law does it explicitly mention tariffs, duties, or taxes. The court found that Trump's tariffs were unbounded in scope, amount, and duration, applying to nearly all imports from almost all countries, with ever-changing rates that exceed established U.S. tariff schedules. But here's where it gets interesting. The court didn't immediately strike down the tariffs. Instead, they gave Trump until October 14th to appeal to the Supreme Court, keeping his entire tariff system intact while the legal battle continues. This strategic move acknowledges the massive economic disruption that would occur if billions of dollars in tariffs suddenly disappeared overnight. Trump's reaction was swift and characteristically defiant. On Truth Social, he declared that all tariffs are still in effect and attacked the appeals court as highly partisan. But more significantly, he previewed exactly how he plans to fight this battle. Now, with the help of the United States Supreme Court, we will use them to the benefit of our nation and make America rich, strong, and powerful again. This legal challenge strikes at the heart of Trump's economic philosophy. His tariff policy wasn't just about trade protection, it was about fundamentally reshaping decades of U.S. trade relationships. Trump has used these levies as both carrot and stick, pressuring the European Union, Japan, and others into what he calls favorable trade deals, while generating massive revenue to offset his tax cuts.
We start in the US with President Trump's trade war, because today it has a new target. As of nearly 2 hours ago now, midnight in Washington, 9:30 a.m. in Delhi, most Indian goods imported into the US face a 50% tariff. The US imposed a 25% import tax earlier this month because of what the administration sees as an unfair trading relationship between the two. Now it's doubled the rate as punishment for buying oil from Russia. So let's just give you a sense of what's involved here, looking at some of the numbers. To start with, last year, the United States was India's biggest trading partner, with bilateral trade worth $190 billion. But here are the numbers President Trump is upset about. India sells a lot more to America than the other way around. So last year, the US ran a trade deficit with India of almost $46 billion. Proof to President Trump the relationship, in his view, is unfair. And here's the other bone of contention. India imports most of its oil, last year almost 40% of its crude, from Russia. Well, President Trump is saying India is helping Russia fund the war in Ukraine. Earlier this month, he accused it of not caring how many...
The specific tariffs under challenge reveal the scope of Trump's ambitions. On April 2nd, which Trump dubbed Liberation Day, he imposed reciprocal tariffs of up to 50% on countries running trade surpluses with the United States, plus a 10% baseline tariff on most other imports. Trump declared America's decades-long trade deficit itself to be a national emergency. Then in February, he targeted Canada, Mexico, and China with additional levies, ostensibly to combat fentanyl trafficking. The global impact has been immediate and severe. Just this week, India was slapped with a 50% tariff due to its oil purchases from Russia.
So there are options. They could potentially cut taxes, but, their economic calculation is going to hold tight for now, because the thinking is that Russian oil is so cheap, they can perhaps eat these tariffs, but how long will that stay in play when perhaps orders are canceled in California, the ports of Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey, and then that forces Indian factory owners to cut their staff, their number of jobs. So if that happens across India, John, we have new reporting since the last time we saw you last hour of a factory owner saying that what is happening now is, from his point of view, worse than COVID in terms of the number of jobs that he has to cut. And what that could do on a macro level, we were talking about this the last hour, is perhaps, and we stress perhaps, move its thinking closer towards new ties with Russia and indeed with China if this action from the United States with these tariffs up to 50% holds for weeks or months. So why that matters is because Russia, India, and China have not exactly been the warmest of friends, especially with China and India. But we have India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi heading to the latest meeting this coming week, or in the next few days, of the Shanghai Economic Organization and Cooperation Summit, which is a group.
The dramatic increase represents a doubling of the previous 25% rate, with Trump accusing India of funding Russia's war in Ukraine. Indian textile manufacturers are already reporting that orders from U.S. customers have dried up, as they cannot absorb these crushing margins. Businesses across India are scrambling to find alternative markets in the UK, Europe, South America, and the UAE to offset the loss of U.S. business. But legal experts have been skeptical from the start. The case that led to Friday's ruling began when small businesses and 12 Democratic states sued, arguing that Trump's tariffs were both unconstitutional and economically harmful. The businesses told the court that the tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,200 to $2,800 per American household in 2025. The lower court had already ruled against Trump in May with the U.S. Court of International Trade, finding that his use of IEPA exceeded any authority granted to the president. That court combined multiple challenges from businesses and states, creating a make-or-break moment for Trump's trade agenda. What makes this case particularly significant is how it exposes the tension between executive power and congressional authority. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to regulate commerce and impose taxes, including tariffs. Presidents do have limited authority to impose tariffs to protect specific domestic industries, which is why Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobile products under different laws aren't being challenged. But the blanket nature of Trump's IEPA tariffs pushed far beyond traditional presidential trade powers. The appeals court noted this constitutional problem directly. The core congressional power to impose taxes such as tariffs is vested exclusively in the legislative branch by the Constitution. They pointed out that when Congress drafted IEEPA, it deliberately avoided using terms like tariff, duty, or tax, suggesting these powers weren't intended to be delegated to the president. Trump's legal team tried a last-minute Hail Mary before the ruling, urging judges to consider supplemental developments, including a Congressional Budget Office assessment that tariffs will reduce U.S. deficits by $4 trillion over the next decade. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick declared that striking down the tariffs would cause massive and irreparable harm to U.S. foreign policy and national security. But the court wasn't swayed. The 7-4 split reveals the contentious nature of this issue, with 4 judges dissenting and arguing that the 1977 Emergency Powers Law is not an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority. This split virtually guarantees that the Supreme Court will take up the case, setting up what could be one of the most important presidential power cases in decades. The financial implications are staggering. If the tariffs are ultimately overturned, the government may be required to refund import taxes already collected, a potentially massive hit to federal revenue that the Justice Department warns could lead to financial ruin for the United States. This explains why Trump's team is fighting so hard to preserve what has become a crucial revenue stream. Trump's tariff strategy has been central to his broader economic vision. He's consistently argued that America's trading partners have taken advantage of the world's largest economy, depicting trade deficits as an existential threat. His tariffs have rattled global markets, strained relationships with allies, and raised concerns about higher consumer prices and slower economic growth. But they've also generated the revenue he needed to offset his sweeping tax cuts. Legal scholars see this case as a defining moment for presidential power. Carl Tobias from the University of Richmond School of Law explained that the Federal Circuit basically affirmed the CIT ruling that the IEEPA does not authorize most of Trump's tariffs, because Congress intended that it cover true national emergencies like the Iran hostage crisis. The court's decision to stay its ruling until October 14th acknowledges that the Supreme Court will likely accept the case, meaning uncertainty could persist for months or even years. The Supreme Court has never directly ruled on presidential tariff power under IEEPA, making this uncharted legal territory. The closest precedent is a 1975 case involving President Nixon's temporary 10% tariff on imports, where lower courts ruled against presidential authority. But the current conservative majority on the Supreme Court has shown deference to executive power in other contexts, creating uncertainty about how they might rule. Trump's appeal strategy appears to hinge on arguing that national security and economic emergencies justify extraordinary presidential powers. His team will likely argue that traditional congressional processes are too slow to address rapidly changing global trade dynamics, and that presidents need flexible tools to respond to economic threats. But the counterargument is equally compelling. If presidents can unilaterally impose massive tariffs by simply declaring trade deficits a national emergency, what's to stop future presidents from using similar logic to bypass Congress on other economic policies? The precedent could fundamentally alter the balance of power between branches of government. The timing couldn't be more critical. With the October 14th deadline approaching, Trump's legal team is racing to prepare their Supreme Court petition. Attorney General Pam Bondi has already announced plans to appeal, while Trump continues to frame this as a battle for America's economic sovereignty. The business community is watching nervously. Small importers who have already paid billions in tariffs are hoping for refunds if the policy is ultimately struck down. Meanwhile, domestic manufacturers who have benefited from tariff protection are lobbying hard for the Supreme Court to uphold Trump's authority. International reactions have been mixed. Some trading partners are quietly hoping the Supreme Court strikes down the tariffs, while others worry about the precedent of courts overturning executive trade policies. The uncertainty is creating havoc in global supply chains as companies struggle to plan for an unknown future. What's particularly striking is how this legal battle reflects broader tensions in American democracy. Trump's approach to tariffs exemplifies his preference for unilateral executive action over traditional legislative processes. His supporters see this as decisive leadership in the face of congressional gridlock. His critics view it as a dangerous expansion of presidential power that undermines constitutional checks and balances. The Supreme Court case will likely focus on the scope of emergency powers and whether economic conditions can justify bypassing normal legislative processes. The justices will need to balance executive flexibility in responding to crises against congressional authority over taxation and commerce. Regardless of how the Supreme Court rules, this case has already reshaped the debate over presidential trade powers. Future presidents will be watching closely to see whether the justices endorse broad executive authority or reinforce traditional congressional prerogatives. For now, Trump's $142 billion tariff empire remains intact, protected by the appeals court's stay until October. But the legal foundation has been declared fundamentally flawed by federal judges, setting up a Supreme Court showdown that could define presidential power for generations. Trump is betting that his conservative majority Supreme Court will side with executive authority over congressional prerogatives. But with constitutional principles, economic stability, and democratic norms all hanging in the balance, this is one bet where the entire nation will pay the price regardless of who wins.